This is All About Bitcoin, a show dedicated to all things, questions, and markets related to Bitcoin, little b for the currency, and Bitcoin, big B for the network. A collective journey to understand, apply, and use this innovation. All Bitcoin, all the time. I'm your host, Michael Casey, filling in for Christine Lee this week. So, top stories in the news today and over the weekend, we have Jack Dorsey, CEO of both Twitter and Square. He's confirmed that he plans to launch a decentralized exchange for Bitcoin. A new division under Square will handle the initiative, and Mike Brock has been named to lead it. Even though their plans are no longer TBD, it appears that the name is going to be TBD. Yes, those very same letters. Brock said TBD is going to, quote, make it easy to fund a non-custodial wallet anywhere in the world through a platform to build on and off ramps into Bitcoin. You can think about this as a decentralized exchange for fiat, he said. And Cuba has decided to embrace crypto in a move being billed as historic. The Central Bank of Cuba has issued a resolution establishing rules to regulate virtual assets such as Bitcoin and said it may authorize their use in commercial transactions, quote, for reasons of socio-economic interest. Commercial providers will need a license from the central bank to continue operations. The move comes amid increasing use of cryptocurrency by Cubans to bypass long-standing foreign exchange controls and suggests that authorities may see more to be gained from bringing crypto under their oversight rather than fighting it. And lastly, billionaire hedge fund manager John Paulson says he remains strongly opposed to investing in cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, calling them a bubble, and says they will eventually prove to be worthless. Paulson said, however, he has no plans to short cryptocurrencies because the prices are too volatile to do so effectively. He said he's continuing to buy gold, anticipating rising inflation as the money supply expands. Paulson, an early backer of Donald Trump, is famous for making a fortune betting against the US housing market about 14 years ago. His bets since then have not been nearly as successful. Okay, checking in on the Bitcoin price. The CoinDesk Bitcoin Price Index, the XBX, is at 48,545. That's more or less flat on the day from what I can tell. And now also for the chart of the day.
The chart of the day is brought to you by Crypto.com, the world's fastest growing crypto app.
Well, we lifted this one from this week's Crypto Long and Short newsletter, which was authored by executive editor Mark Hochstein. It shows a narrowing spread between futures prices for Bitcoin and those of the spot market. That, according to Mark's column, can be tied back to a reduction in leverage in the market as exchanges for futures and other derivatives have reduced the amount by which traders are allowed to borrow to fund their speculative bets. So, how much has Bitcoin grown? Is it now unstoppable? Investors often raise these questions to think about the size of the network. And Bitcoin analyst Jason Dean of Quantum Economics has decided to dig into the data to come up with some answers. Jason joins us now with market analysis and his latest reports on Bitcoin's growth. Welcome, Jason.
Hello, Michael. Absolute pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So looking at your analysis, it suggests that Bitcoin has reached, if I can interpret it appropriately, something of a tipping point. Where there's almost too much at stake for the network to go away. It's too big to fail is one way to think about it. So let's look, first of all, at one chart that you included in one of your reports from Glassnode that speaks to some of this. And this is really, you were highlighting the fact that we had this one-day record transactions, $188 billion done over the network just last week. But I was also interested in the steady growth of those daily transactions, really pretty much from midway through last year up until now. So tell us a little bit about why this matters. What is the significance of this in terms of the unstoppability, if you will?
Well, I think that's the key word, Michael. If we go back a few years, we all knew that there were certain threats to Bitcoin. There were a number of these which are often quoted. The famous, China controls Bitcoin. A 51% will wipe it. A 51% attack will wipe it out. Regulation will take it down. Governments will ban it. The list is pretty long. And my point is really at the stage we're at now, we've kind of passed the point where a lot of these are no longer viable. It's very, very difficult to stop something that has a full network effect. And I went through the Crypto.com report recently, which I think was a great piece of work, actually, and compared it with a couple of other reports and my own analysis. And really came to the conclusion that where we are now is we're too far in. There's too much value, there's too much at stake, and there's very little now that can actually stop it. Really, I could only identify a couple of possibilities.
So actually, speaking of that Crypto.com report, we have a chart from them as well. If we can call that one up as well, that would be useful. So you were talking there about the rise of, if you like, the Bitcoin population. And this is a chart that shows both ETH and BTC owners, Bitcoin owners. I think what was interesting is less so much this is an important rapid growth we've seen since January to June, but you were comparing that rate of growth to what we saw was not on the chart, 2020, 2019. Can you speak to a little bit about what that was all about?
Yeah, I mean, actually answering the question of how many people use Bitcoin is not that easy. It's one of those things you think would be easy because everything's visible, it's on the blockchain, we're dealing with something which is absolute. But in reality, it's a difficult question to answer because people can have more than one wallet, you've got exchange wallets, all kinds of issues involved with this. So we have to try and break it down. So I'd attempted to do this in sort of 2018, 2019 with figures that were available at that time. And I'd come to the conclusion that, just on an indicative level, really, we're looking at about 20 people a minute creating wallets at that time. Then in 2019, it moved to about 24 wallets a minute. But by the time you skip forward to 2021, particularly the first 6 months of this year, you're now jumped to something like 165 wallets a minute being created, 165 people joining that Bitcoin population. I should clarify that's the correct statistic, by the way. That is a big, big jump in what we've seen over the last few years. And it's a testament to this network effect that we're now seeing. I mean, all the things we talk about, on a weekly basis, Cuba, El Salvador, the general adoption we're seeing. My area of focus is Bitcoin, but we have seen the same, broadly across crypto as well.
Yeah, let's drill down into that network effect concept, right? It's something that obviously, we know a lot about in this age of the internet. It's often used as a way to describe why certain platforms succeed and others don't. And it was, I think, most famously described with Metcalfe's work, the Metcalfe law concept. Can you sort of describe how you think maybe this is happening on the ground, right? I mean, 2 Bitcoin wallets begets 4, begets 8. There's that sort of exponential kind of effect. I mean, you've mentioned some of these external forces that are probably aiding adoption, but what does it look like on the ground? I mean, how are the fact that 1 or 2 people are now doing it leading to, say, that sort of exponential expansion?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a whole host of factors, and I probably couldn't pick really 1 or 2 that are more important. But I think the key one, which is playing out right now, is the fact that Bitcoin is something that most people don't get straight away. I mean, it's true in my own case, going back quite a few years now, and I'm sure the story is quite common for most people. So the reality is you'll come across Bitcoin, you'll hear about it, you may not do anything with it, but it sort of keeps poking. It's like a multi-touch approach, I suppose. You'll see it on the news, you'll read an article about it, you'll see a program about it, someone gets involved with it, and it keeps sort of poking you. And this part has really accelerated over the last few years as that awareness has grown. And I believe that's part of what is driving this literally on the ground.
Right. So kind of the discovery process, the actual learning process is now sort of accelerating. Perhaps that's one way to think about it. You mentioned China before, and, yes, back in the day, there was this concern that China could shut things down. And sure enough, China did come along and shut aspects of it down. And, the hash rate has not recovered from that big migration of mining from, a couple of months back. But yeah, the network seems to be working just fine. What's your take on that? And what are the lessons and the takeaways from the big hash rate shutdown that we saw out of China?
Well, I mean, there's lots we can unpack here. I mean, the key one is, first of all, this whole China can control Bitcoin. Well, I think we've proven that's not the case now. Arguably, when I put these articles out, I do get a lot of people get in touch saying, well, what about this and what about that? And someone points out, well, actually, China could have they had more than 51%. The hash rate had about 74% at one stage. And they could have been the guys who, in their regime as well, could have actually hijacked the miners and, forced a 51% attack and made it happen. Yet they chose instead to ban it outright, or mining activity, I should say, outright, shutting them down, forcing people elsewhere. But importantly, so it removed them from the equation in that effect. But importantly, of course, it didn't affect how Bitcoin worked. The network carried on working exactly as it did. Those miners are being deployed. I'm a miner myself, have an operation in Siberia, and it's been a lovely few weeks in terms of mining, in terms of profitability. But we are seeing that hash rate come back up, and we will see it continue to increase over the next few weeks and months, and it will be back there in a very short period of time.
And what other factors can you highlight there that you think are critical to or at least indicators, maybe from the Crypto.com report or elsewhere, that speak to this network effect that you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, my area of expertise is really looking at sort of Bitcoin on a macro level. So I'm always really interested on what the trends are and where we're going. But at the same time, I'd like to see the data that's behind it. It's very interesting to say, well, look, we've got a chart that goes up. Well, I want to know where that data came from, how good is that data, and can we rely on it? And the reality is we can't necessarily rely on some of the absolutes we get from these reports, because there's a little bit of calculation, a little bit of guesstimating going on, but we can look at the trends. And it is very clear, whichever aspect you look at, whichever graph you look at, there is a solid upward trend, and that's in terms of not just adoption and use, that's in terms of transactions, that's in terms of value across the network. Whichever measure you use, we are looking at part of that network effect, and we know that the rates of adoption and the rates of transaction have been increasing in general broad terms. So we can extrapolate that out pretty easily, really, and see where we end up in various different scenarios.
And I suppose we can divorce that, at least for the time being, from price, right? I mean, in some respects, it's like, clearly one would assume that as adoption grows, expectation for the quality, the purpose of Bitcoin, the value of it, therefore rises, and the actual intent to invest would grow. But, the price obviously has a lot of speculation that gets ahead of that. So how do you see this playing out in that regard? I mean, is there institutions were the play of the year to start with? They seem to have pulled back a little bit as concerns around ESG and regulations and so forth. And there's been some return of those institutions, but some are saying, until they really get back, we probably, we'll do okay. But do you see these kinds of numbers feeding into the way that hedge funds and others think about this? We just saw at the beginning of the report, we talked about John Paulson, who clearly is much more of a skeptic and thinks the whole thing's going to collapse into a big nothing burger at some point. But other hedge funds, are they looking at your kind of analysis and those of Crypto.com and saying, "Wow, this thing is real. I need to get in on the ground on this"? Or how does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one word that we can use here, which is inevitable. Again, this is all part of the network effect that we're seeing. These guys ultimately are going to get to a point they're going to say, these guys are in, we need to be in here. We need to be involved, or at least we need to really understand. Remember this, again, this multi-touch process, it works on a personal level, but it also works on an institutional level as well. And they're almost certainly going to be under pressure from some of their own clients who are going to want people to have a look into this. So I absolutely see this playing out and this continuing later on. Because remember with Bitcoin, we talk about this often, we know the supply side of the equation. We know it absolutely. So the only question mark we have is the demand side. And we know ultimately that is almost certainly likely to increase. Again, this is just my view. I think there's probably quite a few people who share that view. And I do think that's where we're going to go. So, and ultimately in terms of price, well, to me, price is on a day-to-day basis is largely irrelevant. I'm looking at the macroeconomic effects. Price will eventually normalize. The markets will decide what that price is. I'm not a trader. Traders are really into the price. I'm not so much into it.
One last question before we round this up, Jason. What's the next shoe to drop? What are you looking for as something, you've talked about this adoption at the local level, the retail level. Is there some big macro event that may push us to another level of network expansion?
Well, there could be, but who knows? I mean, I always say with Bitcoin, we're one announcement from a move either way. We just don't know. I don't think going ahead there's much now that's going to go against it. In terms of trading terms, there might be, but macroeconomic adoption, I don't think there's going to be much that goes against it. We've already seen El Salvador and Cuba, of course, put their flag in the sand, so to speak, on what they're doing. I don't think they'll be the last. We're certainly earlier than I thought we would be at this point in terms of these sort of things happening. But has it moved the market? No, but I think it has helped with adoption, and that will ultimately catch up in due course. So I'm very bullish about the future, and I'm very optimistic as well about the difference that Bitcoin can make to many people's lives going forward. It's not just about the money for me.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Jason. Thanks for joining us today on All About Bitcoin. That was Jason Dean. You're most welcome. That was Jason Dean of Quantum Economics, and that's it for All About Bitcoin. I'm Michael Casey. Join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. in New York for First Mover, your first look at the day's global crypto news headlines. You're watching CoinDesk TV. Bye for now.